Welcome back to Sensible 2020. I'm your event host, Seth Adler. It's my honor and pleasure to be here and doing this. I think that grammatically makes sense. This next session is reducing harm across a spectrum of drug use. Your moderator is Julia Hilbert. Julia, please take it from here.
Hello, I'm Julia Hilbert. I want to give the panelists here an opportunity to introduce themselves. Candy, would you like to go first?
I guess I would. My name is Candy, formerly known as Sam Kerr. I live in Baltimore. I work for Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition as a community organizer and harm reduction educator.
Thank you. Axel?
Hi, I'm Axel Bilbao. I am a harm reduction specialist and a peer recovery support specialist at Rebel Recovery, Florida.
Thank you. And Miles?
My name is Miles Hoffman. I live in St. Louis and I work for Missouri Network for Opiate Reform and Recovery, and I am the Street Outreach Coordinator.
Great, thank you. We have some wonderful panelists here today. We're just gonna jump right in with the first question. How do you think harm reduction can help people who use drugs that may not have a substance use disorder? Anybody want to go first, or Candy?
I can start. So I've been kind of thinking about how problematic substance use is subjective. So when somebody starts having consequences in their life that they consider severe, then it would be fair that they would consider their use problematic. Now, this may be stages before they're already addicted or before they have a problem with dependence or substance use disorder. This could be someone who uses cocaine recreationally and uses a bill and catches Hep C. People who may not necessarily need acute treatment for addiction can still benefit from learning and prevention and education that could prevent them from getting consequences that are problematic in their life. And that's what I was thinking about.
Thank you. Candy or Miles?
I think for people to make the healthiest choices for themselves, they have to have that information in front of them. And for quite some time, people have not been able to have access to that knowledge. So like Axel was saying, like for people to use their own straws and things like that, they might not have a physical dependence on a substance, but if they are using every once in a while, they're using recreationally, harm reduction can step in and be a really good way for people to make more informed decisions based on their own substance use.
Thank you. Candy?
Yeah, I like to think of it as a community care situation. It doesn't really matter if somebody has problematic use currently or in their past. Knowing different harm reduction strategies for using different substances can be useful in instances where you might not be using, say, you might not be drinking, but you might be with people that are. So giving them like harm reduction tips is helpful. Similar to like if somebody's using Coke and they got like a crusty dollar bill, but I have a straw, I could be like, yo, I got this straw, like, let me cut it for you. You can use that instead of a dollar bill because it's totally not glamorous to use a crusty dollar bill, right? So there are different, it's not just for the individual that has the knowledge. If you give the people the information, if you trust people with the information, they can also like disseminate that information into places that it might not get.
Awesome. Totally makes sense. Next question kind of goes a little bit more into that. How can we reduce harm before it might be necessary to intervene with traditional methods of recovery, such as abstinence treatment or 12-step fellowships?
I can start on that one. I think that it's important to engage people in services wherever they are in the cycle of drug use. It keeps them that much more likely to come back while they're out, maybe in a possible occurrence of use, or maybe makes them more likely to engage in contact with somebody who may be able to support them and lead them to resources. When I started out as a harm reductionist and eventually came into recovery and went to treatment and lived in Halfway, and it changed my life, but I saw a huge gap in services there. When someone relapses, if they're in a 12-step community, people just say, oh, let's hope and pray that they come back, and say that's it. And they wait for them to come back, and they don't actively try to engage them and try to, other than like 12-step calls and trying to sober them up, they don't meet them where they're at, provide resources to them that might make their lives better. And so I think that, since it's kind of like a double-sided coin, people are using and then sometimes they're not, and it's also in the middle, and we need to engage them at every single part of that cycle in order to protect them and in order to keep them healthy.
Thank you. Miles or Candy?
I forgot the question.
No problem. How can we reduce harm before it might be necessary to intervene with traditional methods of recovery, like abstinence, treatment, or 12-step fellowships?
I mean, on a personal level, there were different scenarios in which I was in like outpatient treatment and that kind of stuff. And every time I went to outpatient treatment, I learned something. I literally was talking to someone about this earlier today. I always learned something from those spaces, and they were trying to give me like harm reduction tips on like how to reduce the amount of harm for drinking specifically, and other things. And for me, it kind of goes back to my last answer is like, I would literally go to the bar and just hand those kinds of things to people. Like I would just be like, I learned all of these things in this class. You're going to love it. And I would get wasted and then tell everybody else about it, right? So it's like the community care aspect, but also like there was an extended period of time where I drank a lot of booze and snorted a lot of pills. And it was told to me that if you do that, you might die. I needed that information before I ended up in any kind of 12-step program, right? That's not going to do me any good in a 12-step program, knowing that like, if I snort this and drink this, I might die. I'm like, if I'm abstinent, that's not going to do me any good. But knowing about that before I ever reached a 12-step, like potentially saved my life. And so there are a lot of different harm reduction pieces that were implemented in my life before I ended up in a space of abstinence that I think probably saved me. So it's like, why not try to put these harm reduction services in people's life before they even get to that point, right? Before they get to chaotic use or problematic use or any of that. Like, if we can start like even in the beginning of people like starting to find drugs and alcohol and start to educate them from that level, we could probably reduce the amount of harm on so many different levels.
Thank you. Miles?
So I was fortunate enough to grow up with a computer in my house.
Oh shit.
So when I was about 10, we got the internet, and I remember it took what felt like about an hour for DSL to connect. But I was a big fan of getting on Airwed and Blue Light and all those things, and like reading up on things, and a lot of it was anecdotal, but like Candy was saying, like I wanted to try everything, especially as a kid, before I really got into like using pills and things like that. But I learned that like if I'm going to take pills, I probably should not be drinking as well. So that was a form of harm reduction before I even knew what harm reduction was. And then another side of that coin is looking at things like sober living or halfway houses. And a lot of them, specifically in the Midwest, where I live right now, a lot of them are a zero tolerance place where if someone uses one time, you are kicked out. Now, what that means for most people is that they become homeless after they are kicked out. Is that a harm reduction technique? I do not think so. I think putting someone on the street is putting them in more danger. So thankfully, we have had some really great success with medication first models in Missouri, and looking at the ways that we can reduce harm, and kind of looking at things as like, if people self-report in recovery supportive housing, like what can housing providers do to offer more support, instead of looking at it from like a 12-step model of like, well, we're just going to cut you off and disengage. So it has been nice to see kind of that paradigm shift right there. So
Thank you, Miles. Our next question here is, how do you meet people where they're at in your work? And specifically, even if where they're at isn't where you personally believe they should be? Nose goes on Candy there.
I can start if you want. I think it's important, and I definitely learned this a lot, luckily, from my work, who I'm lucky to share employment with people with the same mindset at Rebel. People don't need to be sober to deserve housing, to deserve food, to deserve medication, to deserve the support of someone who can guide them to resources. So, we meet someone, we don't require anything of them. We see where they're at, we ask them what changes they want to make, and we help them make those changes. We tell them how we did it. But we think that if people have those basic needs met before they start being told, hey, you need to quit all drugs, or hey, you need to stop doing this, or you need to stop doing that, it's important to make them at least comfortable so they can start thinking on a higher level than just like, where am I going to eat tonight? Where am I going to sleep? Like, why am I going to stop doing drugs if I'm just going to be outside tonight? So we think it's important to consider everybody as equally deserving of those resources and services.
Thank you. Miles?
So originally my answer to that question looked a little bit different before COVID. And now my answer to that has changed a bit, because what we are looking at in St. Louis is that there's a pretty large population of people experiencing homelessness, whether that be people sleeping outside or people sleeping in vacant buildings. And kind of to Axel's point, like, there are some people who are not really at a point where they want to be forced indoors. But for people who don't want to be indoors because of stipulations around that, or like forced abstinence and things like that, I've started handing out tents, because it's spring and it's raining and it's allergy season. But I have never thought that, like, in my career as a street outreach coordinator, that I would be teaching people how to set up tents. But that's what I've been doing for the past couple weeks. And it's interesting because, I like camping, but I never thought it would be like an urban camping kind of thing. But here we are. And I do have some kind of community buy-in with folks, which is nice, because, we had the same people that we were buying drugs from. And, I can ask them like, oh, is this person still around? And say, yeah, this person's still around and their kids are still doing well and things like that. And, by the way, give this person some Narcan while you're at it. And then here's a tent and here's some sandwiches, and, make sure you're taking care of yourself, and I'll see you next week. So it does look a little bit different now. But the expectations that I have can't be the expectations that I have for myself, because that's putting my own views on other people. So.
Thank you. Candy?
Can you repeat the question?
Of course. How do you meet people where they're at in your work, and especially even if where they're at isn't where you personally believe they should be?
I hate that phrase. I'm just going to put it out there. I hate the phrase meeting people where they're at. just because we say it so much, so often, and I don't think that I think it's beginning to lose its value. You know, once you start to hear like, yeah, a million people say it, it starts to lose its potency. But we say meeting people where they're at, but not leaving them there. And so honestly, what this looks like, this has changed and grown over the last few years for me. Before, I didn't have the ability to separate it from what I wanted for people, because I don't want people to die. And because I'm like, I know the best way for you to use a syringe. Why are you not listening to me when I'm trying to tell you about the best way to use the syringe, right? I want you to I don't want you to get abscesses. I don't want all of these things. And so what it's looked like for me is I have to challenge the thought processes that I have around people using drugs or people not using drugs, and what it looks like for them to receive information. It took me a long time to realize that just because I'm giving the information doesn't mean that people want it. Just because I'm handing out sharps containers doesn't mean that people want to carry sharps containers. Just because I'm offering people that are experienced houselessness, just because I'm offering them food doesn't mean that they're gonna take it, right? If you don't like chocolate chip cookies, you don't like chocolate chip cookies, whether or not you live in a house, right? And so it's been years of just kind of deconditioning of this, just because it works for me doesn't mean it works for other people. And so, on a regular basis, I have to challenge that thought process. Fortunately enough for me, I am given the ability to challenge that thought process on a regular basis because people have new needs, right? It's been mentioned before, it's COVID, right? What is happening? What is even happening? People need masks and they want cute masks. I wanted a cute mask. I have a very cute mask. It's got fringe. It's fucking fabulous. But people need they need hand sanitizer. They want masks, hand sanitizer that maybe potentially is drinkable. I'm not saying come on, let's be honest. And so, I have to continuously be evolving in my thought process whenever it comes to harm reduction and meeting people where they're at, but not leaving them there. At least giving them the information or the supplies that they need. And or sometimes that's literally just my name and the place that I work. Because they might not be ready today for a sharps container. They might not want to know how to inject the proper way today, but they might in 2 weeks. So they have my name and they have the place that I work. So yeah, it's just an evolving thing for me.
Thank you. Awesome. Our last question here of the day is, what is it like to work in the field of harm reduction while being out as a person in recovery? Axel, I'll go back to you.
It's always interesting. I had these different things in my recovery that were coming up that I was afraid of. When I first got out of treatment and I was going to have money again, I was like, am I going to want to go do drugs? And then I got money and then I didn't get drugs. And then when I got my phone back, I was like, oh, am I going to want to call my people and get stuff? And I didn't. One of those things was seeing somebody inject heroin and or smoke crack. I thought that would make me really triggered. Now, this may not be for everyone. Those were my drugs of choice, by the way. But when I was doing outreach, I had to see someone who was trying to inject in a parking lot where we usually do outreach work. And I saw people smoking crack and I saw people injecting right there while we were just giving out supplies, which was a little difficult, but it depends on every different person. But for me, it reassured my choices. And at least it made me happy that I was there to help them, happy that they had someone there who had Narcan, who had the supplies available. And it made me grateful that I was able to reach a point where I wasn't doing that anymore. And it also motivated me to want to help those people more because of this whole thought process that I just went through. So, but I think our recovery is ever changing, with different things start affecting us differently. I've had coworkers and peers who have had to take a step back because their recovery was affected by their work and had their involvement. Even myself, I've gotten a little too focused on doing work with others and lost focus on my own program. And, even recently, I've had to focus more on my own recovery and like do what I was doing in my early recovery, doing it again, just to make sure that things stay good, especially with all this COVID-19. It's difficult for everyone out there, and people without even, not just addiction, people are struggling with their mental health, and I think that it's difficult.
Thank you. Miles?
So for me, I didn't start doing harm reduction work until I had about 6 months in like abstinence-based recovery. So I had some time away from whenever I stopped using till when I got re-involved in harm reduction. And I think having that separation was good for me. When I first started using heroin specifically, I was participating in harm reduction services through a different agency up in Chicago. But then whenever I moved back down to St. Louis, I knew everyone that was working in these agencies, and I had a lot of pride, and I was like, I just can't show my face because I don't want people to know that I'm using and all these things. And I think that's really difficult because everyone knew that I was using opioids. Like there were no questions about that. But now at this point, it's like I don't really have any sort of like issues around me feeling like being around people who are using feels like it's romanticized for me in any way. It really solidifies my choice to not use anymore. Yeah, so I think like I get that question asked to me a lot by participants where they ask me like, isn't this hard for you to be around us when we're using? And I tell them that like it really enforces the decision that I made, because for me, I could either continue using or I could have a life outside of using. I could not separate the two. So that was a personal choice that I made, and thankfully it has worked for me. So that's what I'm doing. It's working for me. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Candy?
Yeah. Harm reduction worked for me until like nothing worked for me, I guess. Alcohol is my drug of choice. Alcohol will always be my drug of choice because it's the one that made me feel the best. None of the other drugs made me feel good, which doesn't mean I didn't do them. Except for hallucinogens, I thought I would kill myself. I hear people have a really good time, but I was not the one. I was not the one. So I got introduced to the idea of harm reduction when I was about 2 or 3 years sober, sober from all abstinence or abstinent based. And I remember sitting in the classroom where I had heard this guy was like, "What is recovery?" And I was like, "Oh my God, I have the answer." But let me just like let these other people answer. Let me be humble for a minute. And so this guy raised his hand and he said what I would have said, which is like abstinent. And the guy was like, actually, like recovery is whatever you say it is. Like, it might be for someone, it might be abstinent for someone, or it might be drinking beer. And this guy got into this argument with the guy that was leading the class. Meanwhile, in my mind, I'm like, oh my God, is that what recovery is? I'm like, if I believe that, am I going to get drunk and die? What's happening? And then there was this little voice that was like, you do what you need to do and let other people do what they need to do and everything will be fine. Like, you believing what you believe is not going to be changed. And I was like, oh my God. And like, from that moment on, it was like harm reduction made sense to me. And that was like, I mean, that is what I take with me every time I go and I do work with people. Is like, I'm not God. I'm not whatever. Like, I don't get to make the decision. Like, I don't even know, like, God is like a whole thing, right? Like, I'm not really interested in white, bearded, sandaled God. But if I were, I still wouldn't, I'm like, not it, right? I don't get to choose what's right for people. So like, for me, yeah, it's been relatively easy. I see people do stuff that I didn't do, which doesn't mean that I wouldn't do it. I just didn't have access to it. I encourage people to drink, because if you can drink and you're a normal person, like, get it, right? Like, get it. If you can use drugs and you can do it in a way that isn't affecting your life, like, isn't like bringing you to your knees, get it. You know what I mean? Like, drugs aren't the problem, and alcohol wasn't the problem for me. I was kind of the problem. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Seth, how are we doing on time? We had one more optional question or not. 5 minutes? All right, guys. Speed round.
Lightning round. Woo!
With the opioid supply contaminated with fentanyl, harm reduction and OD prevention are sometimes viewed under the same lens. As harm reductionists, what problems arise when overdose prevention becomes the only issue stakeholders are concerned with?
Damn.
Okay.
You miss a whole, I'll speak. You miss
That one's
so
definitely
many,
Miles's.
let him do it then.
Do you mind repeating the question for me?
Of course. With fentanyl and the opioid supply, overdose prevention and harm reduction are sometimes seen hand in hand. What problems come along with stakeholders viewing it that way?
Yes. So, here we go. What's frustrating is that I feel like this is a double-edged sword. More funding is a good thing. More money for naloxone, more money for syringes, those are good things. What is difficult and challenging, if you will, is whenever we have people who have been using opioids for 50 plus years, who have generations of people who have been using, where their use is not seen as chaotic or problematic, et cetera, but who could benefit from things like bupe or methadone, but do not have access to these free services. Specifically in St. Louis, something that we run into a lot is there is grant funding for free treatment. Like I mentioned earlier, there is a medication first model here. So there's grant funding available for free medication. Now that started in 2017. Whenever I'm doing outreach up in predominantly Black neighborhoods, people are still just hearing about this. And so I have been telling people about free treatment options, and as soon as they are finding out about it, they are shocked that this is the first that they are hearing about it. I don't really have an answer to it because I feel like for white people, acknowledging something is not an action. Saying like, okay, like, well, we acknowledge this. That's not, you're not doing anything. But like, what can we do to move forward? So, like bringing those services and using white dollars to fund Black efforts is what I have been doing. I just don't know what else is being done across the country. So.
But we just started talking about racism. Come on. Come on.
Alrighty. I'm really glad that Miles got a chance to answer that question for us, at least briefly, but that's going to conclude our harm reduction across the spectrum of drug use panel. Thank you all so much for participating, and it's been a great time.